Live. All right, good afternoon and welcome to the House Environment Committee. This afternoon, we are going to look at the latest changes to H778, an act relating to dam safety with our legislative council.
Good afternoon. This is Mike O'Grady. You should have draft 2.2 with a February 12th date, 12/19 timestamp. This is a proposed amendment from the committee that would substantially change 778. And largely what it does is it took if you remember, 778 as introduced, had a requirement that the Division of Emergency Management do emergency operations plans for all of the high hazard dams in the state. Well, that is being removed. And so you will see page 1, line 6, there is no longer that section 1, which required VEM to do the emergency operations plans for all high hazard dams. Much of the requirements of what was in section 1 is now being moved to the pilot project. Remember that the part of the bill is introduced was a pilot project for VEM to do 2 emergency operations plans to kind of get the lay of the land, report back to you on costs, coordination, scheduling, etc. Most of what was in section 1 is now in that pilot project directive. So that's big change. Those are the big changes. Section 2 of the bill is introduced, which is now section 1 of the amendment, and the appropriation does not change. So you can see section 1 in the proposed amendment in front of you. This is that language that's clarifying that the governor or VEM can order an evacuation without the approval of the municipal local emergency officer. And that's in here because in drafting the bill, there were multiple agency personnel who said that the governor didn't have the authority to declare an evacuation. I don't agree with that. I think there's general authority that the governor and the Division of Emergency Management could assert, but this is just clarifying that this language is not an impediment on the governor or VEM. And that brings you to section 2, which is the pilot project. And you will see that there's still the requirement that they do the pilot project. Now, there's a question of whether or not it should just be 2 state-owned dams or 1 state-owned dam and 1 non-state dam. And I say that's a question because in my communications last night and today, I received a directive to do both. So you will need to consider if you want 2 state-owned or 1 state-owned and 1 other. In addition, when the pilot project was initially proposed, it would have been 2 dams that were high hazard classifications with a population at risk of 1,000 persons or more. Apparently, Ben Green, the head of the dam safety division, recommended that you do 1 dam with 1,000 persons population at risk and 1 dam with 100 persons population at risk. So you get a scale of one might be more rural, one might be more populated. And so that change has been made. You will see one of the dams shall have a population at risk of 1,000 or more persons, and the other shall have a population at risk of 100 or more persons. They are still both high hazard potential dams. Now, one of the things that from the discussions over the past 24 hours was the EOPs are not just one document. They're a document for the regional entities, but there's also an EOP for each individual municipality. So each dam will have a set of EOPs. And that, I was asked to clarify that. So on page 2, they're developing that set of EOPs And you will see on page 2, line 8 and 9, that set shall include a regional EOP and an EOP for each municipality in the inundation zone of the dam.
Where were you again?
We're on page 2,
Two.
line 8 and 9.
Okay, thank you.
So let's revisit what they're doing the pilot project for. 2 dams, you need to decide if they're both state, or one is state and one is non-state. One is going to be hazard potential, high hazard potential with 1,000 or more population at risk. One is going to be high hazard potential with 100 more persons at risk. And both of them are going to have sets of plans for each municipality within the inundation zone. So moving on from there, page 2, line 10, this is effectively some direction on how in developing the EOPs, VEM will go forward. And it directs VEM to coordinate with and collect input from those entities that traditionally are involved in emergency management, including municipal officials, emergency responders, regional planning commissions, state and regional search and rescue partners, which you heard, I think you heard from him yesterday, including swiftwater rescue providers and other relevant interested parties located in the area that could be inundated. Then page 2, line 18 to 20, the division is given the authority to hire a contractor to do the EOPs under the pilot. Page 3, line 1, this is effectively what needs to be in the EOP, at least a minimum. So they have to address how to evacuate medically vulnerable individuals or those who need access to electricity or specialized medical equipment. Then they, on page 3, line 5, need to include the planning and training process for engaging facilities that house vulnerable populations like schools or shelters for the unhoused or senior living communities. Then page 3, line 9 through 11, they need to include recommendations or guidance on implementation and coordination of the EOP by the EOP lead, like give whoever is in charge of implementing the EOP some guidance on how to do it and how to coordinate with state and federal resources. Page 3, line 12 through 14, recommend whether municipalities at risk of inundation should invest or implement a warning system. If they have a warning system, how it should be implemented under the plan. They bring all of this back to you, the EOPs, the sets of EOPs and their report on or before July 1, 2028. And when they do so, they're going to give you copies. It says the 2 EOPs. It should probably say page 3, line 19, the sets of the 2 EOPs. And then a summary of the process of developing the EOPs, including whether or not they contracted with anyone to complete them. Now you're on page 4, line 3. And then a summary of how the contractor or the division coordinated with all those persons that they're supposed to coordinate with, the cost of, and it should say each set of EOPs, and any other information the division deems relevant. So that's what's about the EOP, but remember we were talking about section 1 and moving some of the provisions in section 1 into the pilot project. A lot of section 1 wasn't about high hazard. It was about training. It was about dams that weren't high hazard, or they were less than 100 people at risk, population at risk. So this, as part of the pilot project, will incorporate those requirements. So it's not about completion of the EOPs for those 2 dams. It's about things like recommending how EOPs should be completed for all state or federal dams in Vermont that are high hazard potential and that have a population at risk of 100 or more, including whether to prioritize completion of certain dams, whether the division can complete all of those EOPs by 2035, whether on page 5, line 1, whether the division can complete an EOP for a federal dam or whether the division may only assist those local entities authorized to complete an EOP for a federal dam. Page 5, what the cost would be for completion of the EOPs with the population at risk of 100 or more persons. And then page 5, line 8 or 9, recommend how EOPs could be completed for high hazard dams with a population at risk of fewer than 100. Page 5, lines 10 through 12, funding sources potentially available to the division to do all of this work. Page 5, line 13 to 15, educational resources to give to municipalities, RPCs, and emergency service providers about the need for and importance of EOPs. Page 5, lines 16 through 18, training courses, instructional material, and templates that municipalities and emergency responders may use to develop an EOP for a dam that is not high hazard. And then page 5, line 19 to 21, recommend whether or not those buildings that with a probability of or expected occupancy be identified and geotagged as part of the Vermont alert system. And then last, recommend how often the division, regional planning commissions, or municipalities should conduct practice emergency response for the EOPs that are required under sub A, which is the 2 pilots, and ultimately for all EOPs prepared for dams in the state. As I said earlier, the appropriations don't change. VEM would get $250,000 for the emergency operations plan pilot project. EEC would get $125,000 for the same emergency operations plan pilot project. They both would come from the general fund. There's no special fund revenue for this. As such, with all new programs right now that are going through appropriations, I would expect this to be stripped out and a contingency clause added that would say that no requirement would need to be implemented unless the General Assembly appropriated money for that purpose. And then the act goes into effect on passage.
Do members have questions? And Representative Chapin has joined by Zoom. Yeah, Representative Vaughn.
I don't have a question. I guess, I don't know why we're thinking we have that long to wait before we act to prevent a disaster happening. I mean, in 2035, we could have a spring event, this spring we could have an event, and we don't know about it. And I just think we're very, I mean, the gentleman that spoke this morning, I felt like I wanted him in charge of the state of Vermont in terms of dam planning, because I know we can't afford that, but I just want to say this, having been in emergency management and, been on 2 committees with disaster, and I just read about disaster response and human reactions, and I'm just concerned about how not prepared and how there's not coordination. I think right now between agencies and schools and municipalities, and it's just concerning to me.
We are doing our best.
I know.
And we will have actually emergency management up next, and
Yes.
I'm sure it can flesh out answers to some of your questions.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering if we could have an engineer that works for the state of Vermont, or similar to the gentleman that was here this
Right,
morning.
we have Ben Green is an engineer. He's state's lead engineer now. So
Yeah, he's an engineer.
we've heard from him and we will hear from him again on this version of the bill.
Great, thank you.
Representative Chapin, do you have any comments on this latest iteration of the bill?
I think it gets us pretty close to all the comments that we received, and we're trying to incorporate into the bill, and look forward to hearing from VEM and Ben Green.
Okay, great.
Just, do you know if schools have like flood procedures, like plans for if there's a flood, or are people coordinating with schools?
I am not sure of the state of emergency planning for schools, but I'm thinking our next witness will be able to shed some light on these questions.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Michael. So with that, on very short notice, Eric Byrne is join us, and I think, as you know, there may be some more basic questions that still need to be answered in terms of what we do now. And then I know I would need a refresher on the scope and scale of the dams that you would imagine, or that do need emergency operation plans. And we heard from GMP earlier, you were here, they articulated what they do for their high hazard dams. They seem like well, anyway, we're here, love to hear your thoughts.
To try to address that one quickly, what you're running into is the fact that there's multiple regulations and regulatory agencies in charge of these dams, and they all have different criteria. So I see that we're trying to apply some consistency, and that's great. What I want to do is, like you mentioned, I've had this for about half an hour, so just try to run through with some of my quick high-level wave tops.
If you could, for the record, introduce.
Eric Foran, Director of Vermont Emergency Management. So I do reserve the right to come back with a few additional things as I really pick through the words, but starting with the first page, I think I have the same comment as Mr. O'Grady. I believe the governor and I already have the capabilities to evacuate in the instance of a dam breach, but having it twice isn't necessarily detrimental. Jumping down to the next page, the first part is, so line 8, it talks about having EOPs for each town and a region. I would suggest that you don't have one for the region. The region would be the culmination of the underlying towns. So let's say it's 5 towns, 5 municipalities. That's the regional response, because each one of those municipalities is going to have the regional entities in it, right? They're going to have to look at it as a group project, but individual. So it's a little bit strange in that X town needs to come up with their plan on what their fire chief is going to do, because the fire chiefs are in charge of incident command. So during an evacuation like this, but they need to understand that the town next to them or downstream from them might be asking for the same resources. So they can't do it in a vacuum. So each EOP needs to be complementary to the next EOP to understand that you can't double dip on resources. You'll see that a lot in EMS, where they'll say, oh, we could get 10 ambulances, but the town next to them could get 10 ambulances, and it's the same 10 ambulances. And so the reality, so you need to look at it like a group, but you need to have your individual, because that fire chief in X town, he's in charge of his town, their town, to make sure that their people get out. What it could come into play is maybe a regional shelter, but that would be in that town plan to where those individuals could go. So just having it worded as there would be another regional plan on top gets a little bit convoluted, because you wouldn't have a third plan, or a second plan. It would just be a compilation of the sub plans. That makes
To
sense.
me, it's more like the orchestra leader. Particularly given the way you just described it, you want to have,
Generally, there is no orchestra leader.
right, so the regional EOP maybe needs a different name, but it's a framework for that coordination among the local ones. And Representative Chapin has her hand up, so I'm gonna let her speak to this.
Yeah, I understand the EOP might not be the right language, but I guess I'm wondering about, what governs the command center, what governs particularly VEM and any folks in the command center's roles and coordinate.
That's a whole different Pandora's box. So in the state of Vermont, and this is a little bit of my fire chief hat, local incidences are run by local fire departments. And then if it becomes larger, they can have a unified command, which means that multiple fire chiefs would come in and run the incident together. But there is no organization within the state of Vermont that comes into a region or has overview of a quote unquote region to run incident command. It has to be made up of the subparts. So in that case, for example, it would basically be a unified command, but do you structure that as a entity that gets built, and those 5 towns, just use the word 5 towns. So those towns, as we build this project, would it be that the best case scenario was that they all get together and have an emergency operations center out of the flood area? They're running stuff from there. So I think that's going to be nuanced differences, but it's a fundamental change to how emergency scenes are run in the state of Vermont. There's not a regional response. There is a local response. And that local fire chief, whatever his town, if they bring in assets, they're still in charge of them. It doesn't grow to a bigger response. And even when the emergency operations center is open, we're not in charge of the local incident command post. We are supporting the local incident command post. The way the structure works is an incident happens and the fire chief, the police chief, the ambulance chief, they set up their incident command post. If they need resources that they aren't able to get, then the town that that incident is located in would open its emergency operations center. And then that town gets resources from around its area mutually from other towns. If that emergency operations center run by the local emergency management director using their local emergency management plan aren't able to get the resources they need, then they might go to the state emergency operations center and we might have to activate. And we have various levels of activation depending on the support need. But that's how the structure, and then if we can't, we go to federal, we go to other states, we bring in assets that way. But that local fire chief is still in charge.
That's what happens today. And do you see this changing that?
No, I would see the towns in the inundation zone having their own emergency operation plan. So the EAP, so the dam has its incidents, its EAP gets kicked into plan. Its EAP says, thou shall call these X number of towns downstream. Who they call is different probably for each one, but then those towns spin up their emergency operations plan, and their emergency operation plan says, these 12 houses are in the inundation zone. We have to go knock on their door. We have to VT alert them. We have to put sirens. We have to go pick them up. We have to move them to X shelter. We have to make sure that they have roads to get out because this road's going to be inundated. How do we move them to these other roads? It's a very specific, very geographically located issue for that town. It's not even the whole town, right? It's just going to be whatever the inundation part of that town is around that local river. So they're the ones that are going to know, move people to high ground. They're going to know the people, and there's a few nuances there, like GMP keeps a list of the people downstream. We can send WIA messages to cell phones along the route. So there's various ways to notify them. And I think those are different nuances, but that fire chief is in charge of their 12 people. And then the next town knows their 12 people and the next town knows their 12 people and they focus on theirs. They just need to know that if they have resources that are needed beyond their capacity, they need to know that downstream are going to be asking for the same resources. So that's what their EOP is going to say is when the dam goes, Bolton can't call Richmond because Richmond's already busy and Richmond can't call Waterbury because Waterbury is already busy if the Waterbury dam went, but Bolton could call Stowe, right? So they got to figure out who their next, but that's very specific to that group. And they just need to know that two people aren't calling Stowe, if that makes sense.
I live in a town with a big high-risk dam. But my town already has a plan for evacuating East Middlebury when the Middlebury River floods.
Correct.
So is it different in a town that has a dam? Because they don't flood as often?
It's a specific incident. So we, at the local level, have a local emergency management plan. So that's where that evacuation would be. And we talk to towns, our regional coordinators go into them every spring and because they have to submit them by June. We tell them to look at all hazards. What are all the things that might affect you? Rivers, wildfires, all kinds of things these days. What might affect you and how might you react to those? So a flood could be one of them. And a flood in East Middlebury because 125, the river coming down 125 is high, or because of rain or because of a dam, it doesn't matter. What might happen is that with a dam, you have more advanced notice or you have a few different avenues of notice, right? For the Middlebury River flooding, it would become from NWS about rain, whereas in Bolton from Waterbury Dam exploding, then it's going to come from the EAP. So it's not really different. And that's why we use the term all hazards, right? You need to be able to evacuate. It's a bomb, it's a tornado, it's a wildfire, it's a flood. Doesn't matter. You need to figure out how to get out. And that's what you need in your plan because you can't be figuring out as the fire comes or as the water comes. You need to do it in advance.
I guess I'm trying to figure out the gap this is filling.
This is a little bit, and I can't speak for this group. In my mind, it's a little bit about a specific danger. So after Texas flooding, dams, we had some issues in 23 where they got really close and it made many towns very nervous. So I think they understood that it's a potential danger in their area that they hadn't really thought of, right? We thought of rain, we thought of flooding, we thought of wildfires. Not we, the state, but the town and themselves. So it may be that it popped up on radar because of certain things. In our mind, a VEM, a dam is a potential issue, a landslide is a potential issue, a flood. So we look holistically at everything. In this kind of situation, a dam is very similar in my mind to like Vermont Yankee. So Vermont Yankee was a danger. So the danger, they had to create emergency plans. They had to pay the EMDs in their area to run exercises. They had to create training and planning and exercises. They're the ones that had to create or pay for sirens because they were the entity that created said danger. So is a dam significantly different than that, especially one owned by a private entity? That's not my decision to make. So it's kind of I don't have a specific answer as to why this would be any different. You know, you could theoretically nest it inside a local emergency management plan. And maybe that's what comes out of the pilot project, is that we work with 2 dams and we say that it makes more sense to have an annex to a local emergency management plan for a dam evacuation if you live in the inundation zone for a dam.
I guess I'm just not understanding why it's not already in their all hazard plan.
By statute, they have a local emergency management plan, but it's not defined what every aspect of it is, but it's something that we recommend that they put in. The final decision is theirs. And that's one of my comments on some of these is it asks VM to recommend. We're not really in a position to recommend. We can provide resources to a town like a template, or we can say that if you have sirens, this is how you should use them, but we're not in a position to recommend sirens, because then if a town doesn't take our recommendations and there's a issue, are we liable for that in some capacity because we recommended it but didn't enforce it or imply it? So right now, the local emergency management plans, we go in there, we sit with them, you know, face to face and run through their hazards. But to your point, is a dam breach significantly different than a flooding event? Timing wise, it might be if it was quicker, but it's not that much different than a tornado. So, you know, we recommend being members of VT Alert, so you get those messages quicker. You know, I think some of this nuances here are the dam owners are saying, my EAP tells me to call these downstream towns. If it's an immediate issue, EMDs aren't on the clock all the time. So they're not first responders. So maybe they'll call the fire chief. Fire chiefs, I'm one of them. Like, we're not on call all the time either. We're on call, but we're not at the station. So now you have to get a hold of a fire chief, bring in the fire station personnel. So that's a little bit immediate response, but VEM, for example, our watch officer has a 60-minute window because we're on standby by state statute. You know, you have 60 minutes to reply to a phone call. So we're not an immediate response because that's not how Vermont is set up. The incident command post handles the incidents and then we support them if they need it. So we don't have something's happening this second, we have to be up and running within 30 seconds. We have a bit of a space. So we're not really set up for an immediate, for example, breach of a dam. You know, we have some things in place that could help out VT Alert. But for example, you know, it talks about what we would need. You know, it may be that if the expectation is that Vermont is there immediately, then we need a desk with someone sitting at it 24/7, 365 that's ready to make some calls and do a couple of VT Alert subscriptions. So this as it's packaged, you know, it talks about a pilot and doing it, but as I noodle this and whiteboard it in my brain, it's a big lift. Like, you know, you got these towns that, you know, specifically think about moving vulnerable populations. So now all of a sudden you have to move a whole school multiple miles. All your buses are gone, right? So it's something that is desirable, but it is a big lift. So we definitely don't want VEM to be recommending that they do this. We could suggest it or create templates for them to do it or walk them through how they might want to do it. But there would be some push, I think, there would need to be push from here that says, thou shalt do it. Because that's going to be the issue is every one of these towns would have done it already had they had the resources to do it. And that's what we run into with the EMD that's got 6 hats on. I think someone mentioned that. We go in and we try to emphasize that planning in advance helps during the events and they get it and they want to, but then they have to go work on the sidewalk budget, and then they have to go be a fire chief, and then they have to, so, I mean, it's a resource issue.
I also took testimony earlier this week on the mass casualty plan that's underway. It's like, that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, that could be part of this. For example, if you have the inundation zone, use Waterbury, right? There's 16 towns that Ben Green said are along that. They're all gonna have to evacuate people out of that zone. Some of them will be ambulatory, some of them need oxygen. You have to bring in ambulances to do all that. So how are you gonna do that? Most of those places along that route, they have one ambulance, two ambulances. And if you're using them all for that, and then someone has a heart attack, then you have to go out. So Vermont does not have mass casualty, mass sheltering, mass anything capabilities at this point. We have some larger shelters, but a lot of it are run by volunteers, so trying to get that all spun up in quick order is problematic. And we run into this all the time. We put a lot of weight on EMDs to help us. By statute, they are defined and their job is defined, and we've given them training and give them all the resources they need, but we can't give them time. So I feel like that's a little bit of what this was trying to do, is pull it away from the towns and say, okay, VEM. There was a summer study that came up with 4 suggestions, right? This was one of them, VEM doing it. So having us do it pulls some of that weight away from the towns. Not all of it, because as this defines, they're going to be intricately involved in every step of this. So just getting all the towns in the inundation zone together to talk, we try to do that all the time on multiple hazards. Very tough. I think it goes back to Representative's questions about time, like a year to do the projects, just the 2. That's pretty quick, because we're trying to define not only the EOP itself, but templates for other people to replicate the EOP. So you're looking at the big process, and there's questions in here like funding. So now we have to research funding, and there's questions about, can we write an EOP for a federal dam? So now we're having to look at legal questions. So that is going to be longer, the pilot project for those 2. When we come back, my guess is the pretty significantly reduced amount of time for a dam. But then there's the potential for 70 dams. If you have 70 EOPs that you have to come up with in a certain amount of time, you're talking one every other month plus an exercise. It's a significant package. Again, it's not that it's not a great idea. I'm just trying to put the scope on the wall of how big it is. And it comes up because the towns haven't had the capacity to do it.
Sounds like the towns that GMP dams are affecting are doing this.
GMP does it. So the one they were speaking about, it's called CREEP, and it's an acronym for something around the Chittenden Dam. But the Chittenden, the towns in that inundation zone, the EMDs, have been working on that for about 15 years, trying to get the groups together, trying to bring all the players to the table, trying to come up with a plan that makes sense. We've been involved as regional coordinators over the last 10 years that I've been there. So it's a big lift, but yes, that grassroots group is kind of like the shining light on the hill. Like, they did it. They have sirens. They test them once a quarter. I think they have their meetings with GMP, but it is taking a significant amount of time and a significant amount of resources for them to do it. But they've had the desire to do it. So they keep pushing, right? They don't have any funding. They just go to their meetings. They don't have any resources. They find it. So, it's a true grassroots effort that got that done. GMP is a part of it, but GMP, as he mentioned, is they kind of sit in the back and are there to help. What they do with other dams and what FERC does, they have exercises, and VM is part of those exercises. We'll get a call for an exercise. So it's that first step, like, our dam is going to fail, but then it stops, right? GMP has a little bit more in that they call each of the downstream people, and some other dams do that. I think it was Green River. We did an exercise. They keep a list of the downriver people. But really, that's kind of where it stops. And then they say, okay, first responders, we told you what's going to happen. Now, you're in charge of actually getting those people out of the way. Like, GMP is not figuring out how to get ambulances there to move people. They're not figuring out how to get buses. They're not figuring out the shelters. They're not figuring out evacuation routes. Those are all significant things that should be done in this event. But they're not doing it. They're kind of doing we did our part of it, which is a part of the larger scope. So the EAP portion. And you ask about small dams, potentially, and large dams. I don't think there's a statute yet that every dam has to have an EAP. I think some of the smaller ones may be excluded from it. I know Ben Green's working on templates for EAPs to share across, and that's a similar structure that we would think that this pilot project might come up with is we've created these templates for you to create an EOP. Think about all these things. We can't force you to do it because it's not a state statute. So please use these in a way that's beneficial. Here's some training things for you to use to get out there, some PowerPoints, some online videos, whatever we could come up with. We could give them those. Here's a projected exercise schedule that you could use to do. A lot of it's going to be, is it us running it? Is it the town running it? In the best case scenario, it'd be like the creep, kind of the mantra of the creep at other dams, right? Whoever's involved, they're the ones with the biggest skin in the game. They're the ones that want to do it. So they're motivated to do it.
Speak Chittenden Regional Emergency Access Plans. Got
Done a
it.
great job.
Representative Pritchard.
So I guess I want to really understand what goes into an ELP because I don't. It sounded like that if I was understanding you correctly, you said that, for these two plans, a year is an awful short amount of time. Is that?
This one's a little bit more because you're not only writing a plan, you're creating the templates for it. So to create a template for someone else to use, you got to make your first drafts and second drafts, and then you got to make sure that it works. You got to talk to all the individuals to make sure that it's going to be a useful tool later. So that
How many different people come into this to do
it
it?
depends on the dam, right? So an EOP for Waterbury, as Ben said, there's 16 towns on that. So there should be 16 EOPs. So this pilot project in my mind would be VEM building a template for Richmond to say, okay, we're gonna look at this dam problem. Let's take that VEM template. Every template has space to, okay, we'll use that, we won't use that. But in general, it gives the outline of what their emergency operation plan can look like. And right now it's not defined, right? Is it going to be evacuation routes? You've listed some of the things here. Really, this is defining what an EOP is. Is it evacuation routes? Is it moving vulnerable populations? Is it making sure there's a shelter in place? How do you feed them? Making sure communications are in place? How do you use VT alert? Those are all things that this pilot project has to figure out. How big is that EOP? And then, if you don't require said EOP, they can really adjust it. And the same happens with our local emergency management plans. We give them a simple template if they want to use the simple, if they don't have a lot of space. We give them a very complicated template that if they are really into it and really have the space and the resources, they can make a very defined and multiple appendix LEMP. But it's up to them to figure out what they want to use.
So once these two are done, does that make the ones going forward less time consuming and less expensive? Because of
In theory, it would. You would then be able to go to another town and say, here's some templates, please use them. I mean, on the time side, a lot of this revolves around bringing them to the table in a way that you're not forcing them to the table. So they have to be motivated to come to the table. So, I mean, part of the issue with this is a multiple agency. So think about a small dam that probably has at least 5 towns downstream. So you got 5 select boards, 5 town administrators, 5 ambulances, 3 ambulances, let's say. Maybe if it's some police in there, you got fire in there, 5 fire departments because every town's a fire. So you're talking for 5 towns, you're talking 20 different agencies. So just trying to get them to the table physically is going to be problematic. So they have to want it. You can't force them. We work at the town by town level, so that might be easier, but I think that might be where VEM might be able to add some efficiency is we don't have to get 5 towns to the table. We get 1 town to the table and they kind of define what they think their emergency operation plan is. And then we go to the next town and say, town next door is already using those resources, already wants to. And we try to adjudicate any overlap. And instead of trying to get all 5 in the room and have them all hash it out together, which would be the most efficient way to do it. But it's going to be different every time and every town is different. And, we run, for example, regional emergency management committee meetings. So it's a meeting every quarter of EMDs for that area. Usually it's by county. We don't have 100% attendance at those. So we're working to try to even get to those. And that would be a place where they could come and talk about something like this. Like this is a danger to all of us. How are we all going to respond to it? Like they already have a forum for it. And it's just not holistically happening because of capacity issues. So I think that's what you're trying to get out of this is wedge VEM in there to try to give them some capacity, try to tie the pieces together try to take some of the pressure off them. But you know, in the end, if there's no teeth to it, right? If it's not thou shall have an EOP for a dam, it's a thou might want one, then you're gonna get varied response as well. I didn't get into any of my specifics, but that was a lot of stuff.
You have time. We still have time.
Let me see a couple of other contractor that makes sense. And in my mind, as I whiteboard this, we would probably have the larger dam and a smaller dam. We would probably use a contractor for one and not for the other, just so we could have some scientific variables to be like, okay, well, this one worked better, this one didn't. So that makes sense that you have in there. We talked about having a municipality one. It talks about training and exercises for this under 100 dams, but it didn't seem to mention that for the high hazard dams, which I believe you want in there. So that's one thing. Talked about the fact that we don't really want to recommend things like recommending an alert system. You know, that's where you get into, we could recommend all kinds of things. You know, we could recommend that they had a full-time EMD or a full-time fire chief, and those are things that they can't do. So when we make a recommendation and then they don't do it, what does that mean for them? It's problematic.
Can I jump in?
Yes. With the voice.
Sorry, printing something. It's noisy. I guess I just want to clarify that I think the recommendations are supposed to be recommendations to the legislative body so that we can consider future statutory changes to act on those recommendations or not recommendations to the municipalities. So maybe that's a clarification for the language or for you, but that was the intention.
Yeah, I would just want that to be clear that we wouldn't want the statute to come out and say VEM recommends that everyone gets sirens, because we wouldn't want to be in that position. Not because it's not a great idea, but
Yeah, we can clarify that.
let's see. So these are some of the, to represent this point, like we're recommending how to prioritize completions of EOP for all high hazard dams. So those are questions I'm not sure we're going to be able to answer, right? You just do it in the biggest to smallest order, you do it population wise, like how we can make some suggestions in there. And I think that's what you're looking for. So I think there might just need to be some clarity there. You're asking us whether we recommend all dams or some dams. Yeah, I can tell you, we'd recommend all the dams, right? But it's again about resources. And I think part of that comes from the pilot project. It says, okay, our rough estimate is that town doing an EOP is going to cost $50,000. Now you're multiplying that by 200 towns, right? So what does that mean? And how is that going to be resourced? Maybe the number's smaller, maybe it's bigger. I think you'll get some efficiencies by replicating, to your point, time and money. How you can do that? There's talk about putting it out to contractors, what that means. Recommendations, again, a little nuance there about how to educate municipalities. We would be better in a position to say, if the language said, create some educational materials to share with these towns. So we would create videos or brochures or whatever the case may be. And maybe that's what you mean by recommend. We could come in and that would shorten up the pilot project a little bit if I didn't have to create them. If I just said, I recommend you create a brochure, that would, obviously that makes it longer on the tail end. Because then between when you actually did it and the end of the project, you'd have to create these brochures. So just some nuances there. And the same with the training courses, what that means, to build a good training course. We have training management systems that we could put it in, but there's definitely pluses and minuses to that, what it means, how different towns can handle training courses. Is it us going out to the towns and training them? So I think those are all, if it's a recommend and we just give you the high level picture of what we think would be a great idea without actually creating said training course, or is the expectation that when the pilot's done, we have a EOP template, we have a training course, we have educational materials, and we just can hand that package off after the pilot project? Or is the idea that the pilot project just says that it'd be a good idea to have those? So a little difference there. You talk about BTLR, which we do have some geocaching there, which makes a lot of sense in this situation. But again, it's timing. Like our people are only on a 60-minute clock. So if it's a slow moving incident, then there's plenty of time. But if it's a breach that's immediate, it's going to have to go through a different channel. I think that's kind of off the wave tops of where we sit. I appreciate taking the recommendation to put it down to just the pilot project, but I think there's some still tweaking of what the pilot project's expectations are, because that'll go to the length of the pilot project, what the expectations are when we end the pilot project. In my mind, it noodles on whether or not the 250 is enough to do what the end result is. Because VM doesn't have like a critical infrastructure planner that we can just drop into this project. All of our people are already assigned to things. So if we're trying to figure out the structure, most likely to be a regional coordinator, kind of coordinating the efforts. A lot of this will be the towns have to come up with it because they're the ones that know. We can create templates, but the towns have to fill in the information.
What's the role of regional planning and emergency up in these, like all hazard? I know we have town all hazard plans. Is there a regional all hazard plan?
Yes, there are regional all hazards plans. The RPCs work with the, I'll caveat, under normal circumstances, there's a bit of a funding issue at the federal level. Different issue. So they're currently on hold, but normally they'll do some assistance for us, both in what we call normal days, blue sky days, and then also during disasters, they assist us with some of the data collection from municipalities because they have a close relationship with them. But for the most part, it is our regional coordinators that go out and work with the towns, sit with the towns, work through their local emergency management plans.
But is there a regional emergency management plan?
Yes. But it's basically a compilation of the individual towns' local emergency management plans. So this gets a little bit into the county government issue, but there's no county emergency operations center. There's no county response system. The closest thing we have is a regional emergency management committee that we've talked about, where they can get together in a forum. We do use the RPCs, like I said, in certain disasters as a quasi government level agency because they're broken down mostly by county lines. But there's not really it goes straight from the State Emergency Operations Center to the 252 towns. Pretty direct.
Further questions? For Mr. Bourne?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Any else? Or other members have thoughts on where we are right now? We're gonna hear from Ben Green on this, but I think welcoming emergency management's suggested changes and working with Representative Chapin and council on that would be good. Yeah, okay, Ellis Green, Representative Ost.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, on page 5, number 5, issue training courses, instruction, material templates. Can we change that may to a shall? And can we do a high hazard dam instead of not a high hazard dam?
Sorry, what line are you on?
I'm on page 5, number 5.
Line 16? Yeah.
So I can jump in and explain that so all the rest of this already should include training and templates. I think templates are listed somewhere else for high hazard dams. And then this is a section to make sure we ideally get some thinking back to us on what materials would be appropriate for non-high hazard dams.
So high hazard dams, there are plans and training.
Yes, I mean, the whole thing is about piloting and then ultimately thinking about how we're going to require EOPs for all high hazard dams with, has not a high hazard dam with a population risk. We have sort of like, we're working towards making sure all dams, high hazard dams with a population at risk of 100 or more will ultimately have EOPs. And then there's a group of high hazard dams with a population at risk of less than 100. And then I think number 5 is aimed at all of those that are not high hazard dams, should we have some training templates for any communities or villages that, might have, so a significant hazard dam might have infrastructure impacts, but not the potential for loss of life. So they might need a much simpler, but still some kind of, it's trying to get at that this particular bullet is just trying to get at that group of not high hazard dams.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering about if it'd be possible to have a separate paragraph for schools. Schools train for shooters, they train for fire, in the floodplain, maybe in a high hazard area where schools have to come up with a plan and work with emergency management in their municipality to come up with a floodplain. If there's flooding in the school, how would they evacuate? Because it's not the plans. I mean, the plans are important, but it's them people repeating it over and over again. So they don't have to think, when there's tons of water coming at you, they know what to do.
Yeah,
So-
so on page 3, line 5, there's a section that says each EOP will include in the planning and training process a way to engage facilities that house vulnerable populations.
But I think that what that looks like to me is, that's where vulnerable populations would go to. Those would be places where they would go to. It's not about training schools.
Oh. Yeah, Ella's frozen.
Oh,
I don't know if you can hear us, Ella, but I think,
Sorry,
Yeah.
did I just leave and come back? Sorry about that.
because I think that's looking for locations to evacuate people to, like school shelters or senior living communities. It's not training the schools.
It says include in the planning and training process. And then there's a list of facilities that house vulnerable populations, including schools. So the EOP would need to include and engage those places in the planning and training. Feel free to
I'm
opt
reading-
wording.
Yeah, I'm just reading it different where it says house vulnerable populations or addressing where vulnerable populations congregate. So, okay, maybe I misinterpreted it to think you're looking for where people would go, like to school shelters, or senior living, but you're talking about that schools would be responsible for coming up with the EOP and training and practicing that.
Not that they would be responsible for coming up with anything, but that they would be engaged in the process of planning and developing the EOP, and then also the training for that EOP.
Just to clarify a little bit, the Vermont School Safety Center, which is now under the Homeland Security Unit over at VSP, they work with schools on emergency all hazards plans. So we're working with a school on. The EOP is the town's EOP that does the schools be a part of that, but we might need to work with the Vermont School Safety Center as well.
For
Especially if you're
flooding,
talking about training.
for flooding, right? In the most, like.
They train on all hazards, so they do evacuations. I don't know if they do specifically for flooding or,
Because I think flooding is different in terms of evacuation.
but yeah.
When
so
the
that's-
roads are flooded, that I think needs to be thought out ahead of time,
It's definitely another nuance
right?
because that would involve a lot more groups, AOE, Vermont School Safety Center.
Right. Thank you.
so I have another question for you, Eric. Just in terms of tracking all this hazard planning that we're doing, like, do you guys have a graphic or a way that we can understand this? I feel like there's a lot of overlap among these
First
efforts.
common denominator is the local emergency management plans. So having the towns understand what their hazards are. And so in each one of those towns, there might be something that has its own specific hazard, like a dam or a nuclear power plant. And they might have their own emergency management plan. So we try to make sure that the towns understand that overlap. What is that dangerous thing going to do, and what could it do to you, and how would you respond to protect your citizens?
I think that's why I'm a little stuck on like, what's the gap this is filling? In your mind?
exactly sure, to be honest, because we have a local emergency management plans that if we could put in an annex, we could make a template for a town, and we have multiple templates in a town. We'll go through, and I'm gonna get back to representatives' questions. Like, we try to build a template that's one size fits all. So you start and you're a big town, you got to use all 50 things. But if you're a small town and you cut off 20 of them, and you're only left with something simple. So in that situation, we might have a flooding annex, and that town's like, I don't have a single river in my town, so they cut it out and they move on.
yeah.
They look, and their wildfire is a higher risk. You know, the state has we have our own threat and hazard index, so we know what's dangerous for the states, so we work that into our state emergency management plan the same way. Like, we don't have we have typhoons or tsunamis. We don't put those in there, volcanoes. But we have a general list of what could affect us, and that's how we get the towns to think. So in this situation, again, I feel like I'm a little bit answering for you because this group came up with this plan is they felt that the towns didn't have the capacity to do what they felt was needed to be done. And my concern is always we don't, just telling them to do it doesn't give them the capacity to do it.
Right.
We want to make sure that we support them in a way that allows them to do what they actually need to do.
All right.
I think the templates make it easier, but still a need.
Representative Morris.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. It may be wise for this committee, go back to your local towns and approach your fire chiefs and get a copy of your local emergency management plan to see what it entails. Because it is pretty involved.
It's pretty involved. That's
Pretty involved.
my point. Like, I did an update to our hazard plan in Millbrae, and then there's an emergency plan that builds off that. You identify the hazards, and then the town does a response. And it's just Millbrae's was,
Whereas that's a big one. Some towns are small, but yeah. And our regional coordinators sit with the towns each spring. As legislators were great enough to give us 3 additionals. We have 6 regional coordinators, so we're down to 50 towns apiece. So still a pretty big lift, but used to be 150. So like, they'll go in and they sit with them. And
talk to the Streamalt engineers. They got the numbers all over you, but if you want to feel better about yourself.
So, that's what we are getting in there and trying to make them think about, what are the hazards that are going to affect you? Okay, how are you going to respond to said hazards? That leads you to gaps, right? I need to evacuate a 50-person residential facility, and no one can drive. How do I move those people? Get a bus? Where am I going to get a bus in the middle? So stepping through those things before they have to do it in the middle of the night is what we try to do through that local emergency management plan. So when they do need to do it, they pull the plan off the wall and they can open it up and have most of the stuff. It's never going to be 100%, but a lot of the things that they might need to do are kind of aligned there. That's the same with the state, right? We have our state emergency management plan that defines our response and what levels of our response and who's involved in our response. So whether there's an EOP for a specific dam failure, it most likely just becomes an annex of a local emergency management plan. It said, open your local emergency management plan. We're having a dam emergency, go to the dam EOP, and your dam EOP becomes a little bit more robust. But I think you'll see the same. You would give towns a template. They would whittle it down to what they think they need. And then they would use that. That's the best course of action. The worst course of action is they aren't able to do anything and they don't put any effort into it. So I think that gets back to your original question. I think that's what the point of this is to nudge the towns a little bit more. Because the dam owners they do their EAP and that's required, but the EOP is looking the other way. How can us, the state, help them figure out what to do when that dam potentially has a significant issue?
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
One more question from.
Just one more statement. I agree with you about the plans. The plans sit usually on shelves because they don't have the time or the capacity. It's not like they don't want to do it, but the plans don't save lives. It's the training and doing it over and over and over and practicing it. So I think for the high hazard areas, it would be really helpful, for people to have, where they have to go through all the motion, everything, go through the plan twice a year or something. So everybody knows what their role is. Everything is coordinated. Because I think otherwise it's not gonna help people in the event of an emergency.
Right, with that, we'll take a 10-minute break.